Michael grew up in the kind of neighborhood where people waved from their porches and remembered each other's birthdays. Nestled in a quiet corner of Ohio, the small town of Maple Hollow seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. But even in the most picturesque towns, favoritism has a way of settling in like dust, quiet, gradual, and hard to clean out once it sticks. From the outside, the Dwyer family looked ordinary. David, the father, ran a local hardware store. Janice, the mother, volunteered at church and coordinated bake sales. They had 2 children, Michael, the elder son, and Lindsay, the bubbly younger daughter who could do no wrong. Michael was 3 when Lindsay was born. He still remembered holding her tiny hand in the hospital and thinking she was the most precious thing he'd ever seen. But somewhere between toddler giggles and elementary school milestones, something shifted. Michael's earliest memories were filled with small disappointments that didn't seem like much at the time. On Lindsay's 5th birthday, their backyard turned into a carnival, pony rides, balloon arches, and a magician who made candy fall from the sky. Michael's 7th birthday, a single candle on a sheet cake from the grocery store, and a rushed dinner between his dad's work shift and Lindsay's dance recital. It wasn't the size of the celebration, it was the message. Lindsay was the light. Michael was the background. At school, he excelled. Teachers praised his essays. Math came naturally, and he once won the district spelling bee. But his parents rarely showed up to school events. One night, he took the lead role in the 4th grade play. He practiced for weeks, even rehearsed, in front of the family dog. When the curtain rose, his seat remained empty. His parents arrived halfway through the final scenes, smiling sheepishly and saying Lindsay had a stomachache. She was fine by the next morning. By middle school, the imbalance was no longer subtle. Lindsay had a closet full of designer clothes, gifts for her uniqueness and creativity. Michael saved up his allowance to buy a new bike. When Lindsay saw it and cried, their parents bought her a better one the next day, not because she needed it, but because they couldn't bear to see her upset. Michael learned something that day. Effort didn't earn love. Silence, however, kept the peace. Academically, Michael soared. Straight A's, member of the science club, editor of the school paper. Yet, his achievements barely registered at home. When he got accepted into the state's gifted program, his father nodded, eyes still on the newspaper. But when Lindsay scored a B+ on a difficult test, the family went out to dinner to celebrate her amazing improvement. It wasn't just about who did better, it was about who mattered more. As he grew older, Michael began to internalize a dangerous belief that his worth was conditional, that being good wasn't enough unless someone noticed. And no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't compete with Lindsay's golden halo. He wasn't angry at her. How could he be? Lindsay was kind, charming, and just as caught in the family, dynamic as he was. But with every overlooked award and forgotten recital, a quiet ache began to grow in Michael's chest. It was the kind of loneliness that didn't come from being alone, but from being invisible in a house full of people. By the time he reached high school, Michael had stopped expecting recognition. He joined clubs, volunteered, and took college courses not for praise, but to build a future that wouldn't depend on anyone's approval. He smiled at family dinners, laughed at Lindsay's jokes, and kept his disappointments buried under polite silence. The truth was, he had learned not to hope. But hope has a way of lingering, even in the smallest forms. When Michael received his acceptance letter from Columbia University, he sat on his childhood bed, staring at the paper, heart pounding. He dared to think, maybe this time, they'll be proud. That night, he shared the news over dinner. His father barely looked up. His mother smiled and said, "That's great, honey," before asking Lindsay about her weekend plans. Michael folded the acceptance letter and put it away. He wouldn't bring it up again. What hurt wasn't just the neglect. It was the realization that he had stopped expecting love to feel warm. It had become a transaction. Be good. Stay quiet. Don't make waves. As Lindsay twirled her way through adolescence, adored and protected, Michael built walls around himself. They weren't made of anger but of survival. He told himself he didn't need anything from them, that someday he would leave Maple Hollow, build his own life, and finally feel seen. But the thing about buried wounds is they don't stay buried forever. And Michael's would resurface not in the form of a birthday forgotten or a concert missed, but in something far more shocking, something legal, something that would rip open years of silent suffering. It began the day his grandfather died. By the time Michael turned 18, the hollow ache in his chest had grown into something more jagged: resentment. It wasn't loud or volatile. It was quiet and heavy, like a fog that clung to his bones. He had learned to smile through disappointment, nod through dismissals, and tell himself that independence was all he needed. But deep down, something in him was beginning to crack. He got into Columbia with a partial scholarship, prestigious accomplishment for any teen from a small town like Maple Hollow. His teachers were thrilled. His guidance counselor cried tears of joy, and when he told his parents at the dinner table, his voice was almost trembling with hope. His father looked up briefly from his plate and said, "Don't let it get to your head. College doesn't guarantee success." His mother added, "That's good, honey," before turning to Lindsay and asking how her art exhibit planning was going. That night, Michael sat alone in his room staring at his acceptance letter, the blue and white seal glowing under the desk lamp. He wanted to feel proud. He wanted to believe this meant something. But the silence outside his bedroom door screamed louder than any applause could. Still, he kept going. He packed his own bags, scheduled his own travel, and arranged a ride to the airport. His parents were too busy attending Lindsay's dance showcase at the community theater. He didn't blame her, he never did. But when his friend's father helped load his suitcase into the car and offered a heartfelt congratulations, Michael felt a lump rise in his throat. A stranger had done what his own parents hadn't. College was supposed to be a fresh start. And, in many ways, he found people who saw him for who he was. Professors who challenged him. Friends who asked how he was doing and waited for the answer. But even in the bright lights of Manhattan, the shadows of Maple Hollow lingered. Every time he accomplished something, he hesitated to tell his parents. Their disinterest had become so predictable. It wasn't worth the risk of hope. During his sophomore year, Michael landed a summer research position at a prestigious financial firm. Only 2 students in the entire university were selected, and he was one of them. When he called home to share the news, his father barely reacted. "That's fine, but Lindsay's gallery piece might get shown in Cincinnati next month," he said. His mother chimed in, "That's nice, dear. Be careful not to work too hard." Michael hung up and stared at his phone. Something twisted inside him. It wasn't just sadness anymore, it was anger. For the first time, he didn't cry. He didn't even feel hurt. He felt cold, numb. He realized, in that moment, that he was chasing something he would never catch. That their love had always come with terms. Lindsay was the favorite. He was the reminder of everything they didn't want to talk about. When he went back to therapy that fall, he didn't start with a story about his childhood. He started with, "I think I'm angry, and I don't know what to do with it." His therapist listened quietly, and then asked, "Have you ever told them how you feel?" Michael laughed. They wouldn't understand. They'd make it about themselves. They always do. It was true. Every conversation that veered toward his feelings became a lecture on gratitude. His father would bring up how he bought Michael braces in 8th grade. His mother would remind him they let him live at home during his first semester to save money. They saw these basic parental acts as grand gestures, as if they had gone above and beyond. Meanwhile, they never acknowledged the countless times they ignored him, minimized his success, or demanded he be the bigger person. He had always been the one expected to rise above, but even the strongest backs buckled under too much weight, and Michael's was finally breaking. One night during winter break, Lindsay asked him if he wanted to come to her open mic night. Michael politely declined, saying he was tired. When she pressed, he said something he had never said before. "Lindsay, I'm proud of you, but I'm tired of pretending none of this hurts." She blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" He shook his head. "Nothing. Never mind." That was the problem. He had spent his entire life biting his tongue. He had allowed the silence to fester, and now it had metastasized into resentment that made it hard to even look at his parents without feeling like a stranger in his own family. Still, part of him wanted peace. Part of him wanted them to finally say, "We see you, we're sorry." But peace isn't found in begging for someone to value you, it's found in learning to value yourself. And Michael was just beginning to understand that. He graduated with honors, got a job at a respected firm in Chicago, and bought his first home by 27. He was doing everything right, but the emptiness followed. Success without support is lonely. He thought maybe, just maybe, his parents would be proud now. But when he invited them to visit his new place, they declined. "It's too far," his dad said, "and Lindsay needs help with her move to her new studio apartment." Michael didn't ask again. The moment he signed his mortgage papers, he sat in the quiet of his empty living room and thought, is this it? He had built a life from scratch, brick by brick, without a blueprint or cheerleader. And yet, it still felt like something was missing. Not love, he had that in friends and mentors, but recognition. From the people who were supposed to give. It first started was in this haze of success and sadness that Michael's grandfather, Walter Dwyer, passed away. A quiet man with a firm handshake and a soft heart, Grandpa Walt had been the only adult in his life who made him feel seen. When Michael was 10, Grandpa took him fishing and listened to him talk about constellations. When he got his first job, at 16, Grandpa mailed him a card with $20 and a handwritten note. "Proud of you, kid." Michael hadn't realized how much those small moments mattered until they were gone. But as it would turn out, Grandpa Walt wasn't finished teaching lessons. His will, soon to be revealed, would become the spark that set everything ablaze. A spark that would challenge Michael's silence, force old wounds open, and bring years of resentment to a head. The breaking point had come, but what came next would define the rest of his life. Michael's 20s unfolded like a well-written resume, impressive, efficient, and largely unnoticed by the people who should have cared the most. While his peers were figuring out who they were, stumbling through first jobs and forgotten dreams, Michael moved with quiet precision. He graduated from Columbia with honors, secured a job at one of the top financial firms in Chicago, and spent his evenings reading investment reports, while his colleagues hit the bars. But even as his life moved upward, the applause never came that he expected it anymore. His apartment was modest but modern, a one-bedroom high-rise, overlooking the skyline. The first night he moved in, he stood on the balcony holding a beer, watching the city lights flicker like constellations, and thought, "I made it." He even took a picture of the view and texted it to his parents, adding, "Settled in first place. Is official." His mother replied with a thumbs-up emoji. His father said nothing. 2 weeks later, he got a call not to ask about the apartment, but to help Lindsay with her taxes. That became a pattern. When Michael was promoted to senior analyst at 26 a year earlier than expected, his team threw a surprise lunch. He got a plaque, a bottle of scotch, and a handshake from the VP. That night, he called home out of habit. His mum picked up, listened for a moment, then said, "That's great, sweetie. Oh, did you know Lindsay's thinking about starting her own Etsy shop?" Michael smiled through the phone. "That's nice, Mom." He hung up and poured himself a glass of wine. For a long moment, he stared at the plaque on his bookshelf. It felt heavy in all the wrong ways. The truth was, success, without witness, has a strange emptiness. You push yourself, not because anyone's cheering you on, but because you've convinced yourself it's the only way to matter. Michael built a life from the quiet drive to prove, maybe to himself, maybe to no one, that he was enough, that he could succeed on his own. But somewhere along the way, that silent drive had become isolating. He watched friends lean on their parents when things got tough, when rent was due, when relationships fell apart, when jobs got lost. Michael never asked. Not because he didn't need help, but because he already knew the answer. He remembered a time in college when he'd gotten sick, a brutal stomach virus that left him in bed for 2 days. He called his parents out of desperation, just to hear a voice. His father told him to drink water and tough it out. His mother said, "Well, at least you don't have to worry about Lindsay's allergies." That memory stayed with him. And yet, he never stopped giving them chances. Every Christmas, he went home with gifts. Every birthday, he called first. Every milestone, he gave them the benefit of the doubt. Because part of him still hoped something might change. That one day they'd look at him and see the son they never celebrated, standing tall in front of them, asking for nothing but a little recognition. It never came. Lindsay, meanwhile, was still living at home, now 25, and working part-time at a pottery studio. Their parents paid her phone bill, her car insurance, and covered the rent she never paid. They called it helping her find herself. Michael called it what it was, enabling. But he kept that opinion to himself. After all, saying anything critical about Lindsay was like swearing in church. You didn't do it. Not unless you wanted a lecture about how not everyone's path looks the same. It wasn't about Lindsay having support. Michael didn't resent her for being loved. He resented that love seemed conditional for him and unconditional for her, that he had to climb mountains to get a nod while she got parades for showing up. Still, he tried to hold on to grace. When Lindsay had her first art show at a local coffee house, he flew in to surprise her. She cried when she saw him, and for a moment, it felt like old times, 2 kids who didn't ask to be compared, just trying to find their place. He hugged her and told her she was talented, and he meant it. But when their mother introduced him to someone as Lindsay's older brother, who works in finance, I think the sting came right back. He left early the next morning. The years continued like that. Wins stacked up, quietly. He paid off his student loans, saved enough for a down payment, bought a small house in Evanston, with a backyard and a cherry blossom tree he planted himself. His neighbors knew more about his life than his family ever did. At work, he mentored interns. At home, he read books on emotional resilience and learned to cook elaborate meals for one. He wasn't lonely, but he was alone. What he never said out loud but often thought on those quiet evenings was this: I did everything they wanted. I became everything they said mattered. And it still wasn't enough. Sometimes, late at night, he'd scroll through old photos once Grandpa Walt had taken. The fishing trips, the science fair awards, even a blurry snapshot of him giving a speech at graduation. Photos his parents never framed, but his grandfather had saved like treasure. That's why when the call came that Grandpa had passed away, Michael didn't just feel grief. He felt something deeper, the loss of the only adult who had ever made him feel seen. Grandpa Walt had shown up, quietly, consistently, and without condition. And though Michael didn't know it yet, the legacy Walt left behind would be more than just memories. It would be the moment that finally cracked the silence. The call came on a cold Tuesday morning. Michael was in the middle of reviewing a quarterly earnings report when his phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number from Ohio. Something in his gut tightened. He stepped out into the hallway and answered, already bracing himself. It was his Aunt Carol. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of bad news. Michael, Grandpa Walt passed away early this morning. Michael didn't speak at first. He leaned against the wall, his fingers tightening around the phone. The words sank in slowly, like frost creeping across a window pane. He managed to quiet, "Thank you for calling," and promised to catch the next flight home. The funeral was held that weekend in the same white-steepled church where Walt Dwyer had sung in the choir every Christmas Eve for 40 years. The pews were full, neighbors, old friends, veterans from his Navy days. Walt had been that kind of man, quiet but unforgettable. The type who slipped $20 bills into birthday cards and never forgot an anniversary. Michael stood by the casket, watching people pay their respects. Some placed flags, others wept. But what struck him most was the way everyone spoke about his grandfather, not in grand stories, but in simple affirmations. He always showed up. He treated everyone the same. He listened. When it was his turn to speak, Michael walked to the pulpit, clutching a folded piece of paper he hadn't planned to read. He looked out at the sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces and said, "My grandfather wasn't loud, but he never let silence mean neglect. He saw me, even when others didn't." After the service, Michael sat with his grandmother, Margaret, on the church steps as the sun dipped below the trees. She held his hand and said softly, "He was proud of you, you know, always. He carried your college newspaper articles in his wallet." Michael smiled and blinked back the sting in his eyes. "I wish I'd told him that more." 2 weeks later, the family gathered for the reading of the will. It was held in the office of Walt's longtime attorney, a man named Richard Klein, who had known the Dwyers since Michael was a child. The atmosphere in the room was tense, but Michael stayed quiet, seated between two cousins and just across from his parents, who had arrived late, Lindsay in tow. Richard cleared his throat and began. Walt's estate was larger than most expected. Years of wise investing, real estate holdings, and a sizable pension had accumulated into a nest egg, meant not just to honor his life, but to support those he loved. The terms were simple. Each of Walt's grandchildren, Michael, Lindsay, and 3 cousins, would receive an equal share of $500,000. His children, Michael's father, and 2 aunts would divide the remaining estate equally. No conditions, no caveats. Fair and square. Michael sat in stunned silence. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard. $500,000. He could hardly process it. He wasn't thinking about houses or debt or startups. He was thinking about that line in the will. Each grandchild shall receive an equal portion. It was the first time in his life that someone in his family had treated him equally, intentionally, explicitly, and without hesitation. Across the table, his father shifted uncomfortably. His mother stared at the floor. Lindsay looked confused. No one said a word as the rest of the details were read. But later that night, the storm broke. Michael had just returned to his grandmother's house when his parents pulled him aside into the kitchen. His father's jaw was tight. His mother's voice was sweet, almost rehearsed. "Michael," she began, "we've been thinking. Lindsay really needs that money more than you. She's struggling." He blinked. "You're asking me to give up my inheritance." "Not asking," his father interjected. We're saying it would be the right thing to do. Michael's chest tightened. This isn't about what's right. This is about Grandpa's wishes. His father scoffed. Your grandfather didn't understand the full situation. If he had, he would have made adjustments. Michael stared at them, stunned by the audacity. The bitterness he'd tried so hard to bury threatened to rise again. I worked hard. I built everything on my own. Lindsay has had your help her entire life, he said. This is the one time something was fair. His mother's eyes welled with tears. Don't be cruel, Michael. She's your sister. But Michael wasn't being cruel. He was being honest for the first time in years. I'm not giving her my share, he said calmly. Grandpa made a choice. You don't get to rewrite that, because it doesn't fit your narrative. The conversation ended in slammed doors and whispered accusations. That night, Michael sat in the guest room staring at the ceiling, feeling the familiar ache settle in his chest, but also something new. A flicker of defiance. A quiet kind of strength. What he didn't know yet was that this decision, his refusal to be erased, would ignite a much bigger fire. His father, acting as co-executor of the will, wasn't done trying. And Michael's fight for fairness was far from over. What had begun as a final gift from a loving grandfather was about to become a legal and emotional battleground. And Michael would soon learn just how deep the roots of favoritism really went. It started with a knock on his door. Michael had returned to Chicago 2 days after the will reading, hoping that the tension would dissolve with distance. He went back to work, back to his quiet apartment, trying to push aside the nagging unease that trailed behind him like a shadow, but it didn't stay away for long. That Friday evening, just as he was preparing dinner, his phone lit up. It was his father. Reluctantly, Michael answered. Hey son, his father began, voice uncharacteristically soft. Mind if we talk? For a minute, Michael leaned against the kitchen counter. Sure. There was a pause just long enough to feel loaded. Your mom and I were talking. We think it would be best if you gave your portion of the inheritance to Lindsay. It was. Michael exhaled slowly. You're serious? His father didn't flinch. She needs it more. She's behind on her car payments, struggling with rent. You've got a house, a good job. She doesn't have your advantages. Michael's grip tightened around the phone. His dinner sat untouched. On the stove. I worked for everything I have, he said. No one handed it to me. She's had a rougher time, his father continued. She didn't have your discipline. She's an artist. Michael, not everyone fits into a corporate mold. Michael's voice grew sharp. And somehow, that's my fault. His father sighed. You always were the stubborn one. I'm not saying Lindsay's better than you, but she's fragile. She needs this more than you do. Michael wanted to laugh, wanted to scream, but instead, he said the one word he had rarely said in his life, especially to his parents. No. Silence. What do you mean, no? His mother's voice chimed in from the background, tinny through the speaker. Michael had had enough. It wasn't your money to begin with. It was Grandpa's. He made the decision. You don't get to override that. Then came the guilt trip. Like clockwork, his mother's voice broke into a tremble. After everything we did for you, the braces, the school supplies, letting you live at home, this is how you repay us. Michael's stomach turned. He'd heard this song before. Each favor they mentioned like a receipt. Proof that he owed them something. Proof that love wasn't love, but a debt to be paid back with silence and sacrifice. You mean the bare minimum of parenting? He snapped, before softening. I'm sorry, but I'm not doing this. I won't hand over what's mine, just to keep pretending everything's okay. His father's tone shifted from persuasion to threat. If you don't, you're dividing this family. Michael's jaw clenched. I think the division started long before this conversation. That night, he received a long email from his mother, an emotional essay on family, loyalty, and disappointment. She ended it by saying that if he accepted the money, they might not be able to look at him the same way again. He didn't reply. Instead, he sat on the edge of his bed and remembered all the times he'd been expected to step aside. When Lindsay wanted his bike and got a better one. When she needed attention and he got ignored. When his achievements were dimmed so her mediocrity could shine. This time, he wasn't stepping aside. But the story didn't end with guilt trips. Days later, Michael learned that his father, who was one of the estate's executors, was reinterpreting the will. He had declared that Grandpa Walt would have wanted Lindsay to have Michael's share, had he fully understood her struggles. His father claimed he was acting in good faith, in honor of what Grandpa would have really intended. Michael felt like the air had been knocked out of him. It wasn't just betrayal, it was theft disguised as righteousness. A lifetime of being overlooked had now escalated into an attempt to erase him from the legacy entirely. He reached out to his grandmother when she heard what had happened. Her voice trembled not with sadness, but fury. "This is not what your grandfather wanted," she said. "He made it clear, years ago. Everyone gets an equal share." That was his line in the sand. She promised to send documents proof that this wasn't just about money, but about honoring a man's final wishes. And perhaps, more importantly, honoring the grandson he had quietly supported all along. Michael knew now that this was bigger than one check. This was the reckoning. The moment where years of quiet suffering met a wall of injustice that could no longer be ignored, and it was far from over. Because what came next wasn't just a disagreement, it was a war. And Michael wasn't backing down this time. The email came at 6:42 a.m. on a gray Wednesday. Michael had just poured his first cup of coffee when he saw the subject line in bold letters. Clarification regarding estate distribution. It was from his father. He opened it slowly, heart pounding in that familiar, heavy rhythm like before a high school test or a long-awaited phone call that he already knew would disappoint him. But this was different. This wasn't about disappointment, it was betrayal. The email was formal, written like a legal memo instead of a message from a parent. His father explained that, after reviewing the circumstances and evaluating Lindsay's financial hardship, he had decided to reallocate the inheritance in a way he believed better reflected Grandpa Walt's true intentions. Michael's portion, according to the new interpretation, would be given to Lindsay in full. His father signed it as co-executor of the estate. No phone call, no conversation. Just a digital notice that everything Walt had left him, everything Michael had been quietly grateful for, was being taken away. Just like that. For a few seconds, he just sat there, coffee cooling in his hand. His mind couldn't process it. Could they do that? Legally? Ethically? Didn't the will mean something? He forwarded the email to his grandmother, Margaret, adding only one sentence. "Is this even legal?" She called within 10 minutes. "Michael," she said, her voice trembling with both rage and resolve. "Your grandfather explicitly stated that all grandchildren were to be treated equally. He even added a clause to prevent this kind of manipulation." Margaret explained that several years earlier, Michael's parents had pressured Walt to leave everything to Lindsay. He had refused. He told them, in no uncertain terms, that he wouldn't pit his grandchildren against each other. In fact, he'd included a clause in the will, stating that anyone who attempted to dispute the equal distribution would forfeit their share. "I begged him to put it in writing," Margaret said. "He did, and now they've overstepped." Michael's hands were shaking. It wasn't just the money, it never really was. It was the principle. It was years of being treated like a second-class citizen in his own family. Now they were trying to erase him from his grandfather's legacy too. As if his hard work, his loyalty, his quiet pain meant nothing. Later that day, he reached out to a lawyer recommended by a colleague. The attorney reviewed the will, the inheritance clause, and the new reinterpretation drafted by Michael's father. "This isn't just immoral," the lawyer said flatly. "It's illegal." Michael felt something unfamiliar swell in his chest. Vindication. And then, immediately after, a wave of exhaustion. Because fighting his parents wouldn't be about paperwork. It would be emotional warfare. When he called his father to confront him, the conversation unraveled quickly. "I saw your email," Michael began, voice steady. "It's not going to hold up. I've spoken to an attorney." There was a pause, then a scoff. "I thought we agreed to keep this in the family," his father said. "Dragging lawyers into this makes you look greedy." "I'm not greedy," Michael replied. "I'm standing up for myself at once." His father's tone turned icy. "Your grandfather wouldn't have wanted this tension." Michael didn't hesitate. "No. But he also wouldn't have wanted you to override his will." Then came the deflections, the classic tactics. Guilt, manipulation, revisionist history. "We supported you." His mother chimed in later, calling him in tears. "Don't you remember? We gave you everything." "No," Michael said. This time, without a hint of apology. "You gave me conditions. Lindsay got love without strings. I got a checklist of what I was allowed to feel grateful for. And still, no remorse. No admission of wrongdoing. Just more accusations that he was trying to destroy the family. That he was being ungrateful, selfish, heartless." The breaking point came when his father, red-faced and defiant, claimed that Walt would have changed his mind if he had seen how fragile Lindsay had become. Michael could hardly believe it. "Then why didn't he?" he asked. "Why didn't he change it before he passed?" "Because he knew He knew how this family worked, and he tried to protect me the only way he could. There was nothing more to say. That weekend, Margaret took action. She contacted Walt's lawyer, the secondary executor, and her other children, my aunts and uncles. One by one, they rallied. They knew the truth. They'd seen the favoritism, the imbalance, the way Michael had been overlooked again and again. And now, they saw it spilling into the legal world like poison. The document was challenged. Michael's father was stripped of his executor privileges. The original terms of the will were reinstated in full. Michael would receive what his grandfather intended, not just the money, but the affirmation that he mattered. But the damage had been done. His parents barely spoke to him. Family gatherings grew quiet and cold, and Lindsay, caught in the middle, simply shrugged when he asked why she didn't speak up. Mum and Dad know best, she said. It hurt more than he could admit that. Even now, even as he stood up for himself, he still felt alone in his own family. But beneath that pain was something else. Something steadier. He had drawn a line. For the first time in his life, he had said, no more. And what came next would test that line like never before. Margaret Dwyer had always been the kind of woman people underestimated. She wasn't loud. She didn't lecture. She preferred quiet resolve over confrontation. But beneath her soft sweaters and warm casseroles was a spine of steeler strength, forged through decades of raising a family, enduring heartbreak, and loving a husband who believed in fairness more than favor. When she learned what her son McCall's father had attempted to do with the will, something inside her reignited, not just anger, but purpose. She had stood by for years, watching the quiet imbalance in her family, how Michael was passed over, how Lindsay was praised for simply existing. She'd seen it in birthday parties, school recitals, even in how they spoke about their children around the dinner table. But this was too far. The morning after Michael forwarded her the email, Margaret pulled down an old lockbox from the top shelf of her closet. Inside were papers that hadn't seen daylight in years, handwritten notes from Walt, drafts of the will, emails he had sent her late at night as he debated the best way to divide the estate. She found the final signed version, marked clearly, with a clause that stated, any attempt to alter or dispute this equal distribution shall result in forfeiture. She knew what she had to do. First, she met with Richard Klein, the attorney who had handled Walt's affairs. She slid the documents across his desk and said calmly, I want this enforced. To the letter. Richard nodded. Your husband was very clear. We'll back you up. Next, she called her two daughters Michael's aunts and told them everything. Not just about the will, but about the years of favoritism, the financial imbalance, the way Michael had been pushed to the margins while Lindsay was held up like a porcelain doll. To Margaret's surprise, they didn't argue. They didn't hesitate. They had seen it too. And for the first time, they were ready to speak out. What followed was a series of family meetings, awkward, emotional, and overdue. Margaret took the lead. At one gathering, held at her house with nearly everyone present, except Michael's parents, she stood up at the head of the living room and said words that had been waiting years to be spoken. I stayed quiet for too long, but fairness isn't something you whisper about, it's something you stand up for. Walt wanted equality, and that's what we're going to honor. She spoke of Michael's accomplishments, of how Walt had kept newspaper clippings of his achievements in a folder by his nightstand. She told stories about how proud he was of Michael, not because he was successful, but because he never let pain harden him. He just kept going. Quietly. Tears welled in Michael's eyes as his grandmother opened that folder and showed the room. Photos, certificates, articles, even the program from the school play his parents had missed. You were never invisible to us, she said. Not to your grandfather, and not to me. It was a moment of unexpected healing. In that living room, surrounded by cousins and aunts and uncles who now saw him differently, Michael felt a shift. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was being defended. The will stood. The lawyer sent formal notice. Any attempt to alter the estate would violate legal protections and be met with consequences. Michael's father, confronted by both legal authority and family outrage, backed down, begrudgingly, bitterly, but he backed down. Still, the emotional fallout was impossible to avoid. His mother left a voicemail crying, saying he had turned everyone against them, that he had torn the family apart for money. But Michael knew better. He hadn't torn the family apart. He had simply peeled back the illusion that everything was fine. What broke was already cracked. All he did was stop pretending. Margaret, however, didn't just defend him, she stayed close. They began to talk weekly, not just about legal updates, but about life. She told him about how Walt had grown up poor, how every cent he earned was with the idea that his grandkids would have more than he didn't. Not just more money, but more fairness, more dignity. She said something one afternoon that stuck with Michael. You've always had to fight twice as hard, just to feel half as seen. But I see you, Michael, and I'm proud of you not for what you've accomplished, but for not letting bitterness take root in you. It was the affirmation he didn't know he was still craving, and it planted a seed, because now that he'd stood up for himself, now that he'd defended what was his, Michael began to wonder, what else had he been too afraid to confront? The answer would come, not from his parents, but from the very last person he expected, and it would begin with a knock on his apartment door. The knock on the door came just after sunset. Michael had been reading by the window, a cup of chamomile tea cooling in his hand, when the soft rapping echoed through the apartment. When he opened it, he didn't expect to find his cousin Rachel standing there, coat dusted with snow, eyes hesitant but clear. I thought it was time someone said this in person, she said, stepping in. Rachel had always been neutral, pleasant, observant, the kind of cousin who smiled at holidays, but never took sides. But tonight, her posture was different. She took a seat at the kitchen table, folded her hands, and looked him in the eye. We've all seen it, she said quietly, the way they've treated you. For years. Some of us just didn't know what to do. But after what happened with the will, that was the last straw. Michael didn't speak, but something in him eased. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't making this up. For the first time, someone outside his grandmother had confirmed what he always felt, but was too afraid to claim out loud. The favoritism, the erasure, the gaslighting, it was real. Rachel pulled a manila envelope from her bag and slid it across the table. Aunt Carol and Uncle Mike wanted you to have this. It's a signed statement supporting the original will, denouncing what your father tried to do. Inside was more than just ink on paper. It was validation. In the weeks that followed, everything shifted. Richard Klein, Walt's longtime attorney, filed the official documents to strip Michael's father of his executor powers, with Margaret and the other co-executor stepping in. The court reviewed the challenge quickly. The language of the will was airtight. Walt had anticipated conflict and protected his legacy accordingly. The ruling came swiftly. The inheritance was to be distributed exactly as stated, no modifications, no reallocation. Michael's share was reinstated in full. Legally, it was a victory, but emotionally, it felt more complicated. His father didn't call. His mother sent a short, cold message. Hope you're happy. You got what you wanted. Lindsay stayed silent. Michael sat alone in his apartment that night. The court documents folded neatly beside him, and felt both triumphant and hollow. Yes, he'd won. Yes, the law was on his side. But the people he had spent his life trying to please, his own parents, saw him now as the enemy. What stunned him wasn't their anger. It was their ability to rewrite history, to cast him as selfish for wanting what was fairly given. That weekend, he went back to Maple Hollow, not to see them, but to have lunch with Margaret. She welcomed him with warm biscuits and coffee, and they sat in her sunroom while birds chirped beyond the frosted glass. You did the right thing, she told him, placing her hand gently over his, and I hope someday they'll see that. Michael looked out at the bare trees lining the yard. Do you think they ever will? Margaret didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice was soft but unwavering. Maybe not, but you can't live your life waiting for their approval. You already did that, and it hurt you. There it was, emotional clarity, the kind that doesn't come from arguments or court rulings, but from truth spoken gently by someone who loves you, without conditions. Michael realized in that moment what had truly changed. He no longer needed their validation. He'd spent so many years thinking that success would finally earn their love, that degrees, jobs, money would close the distance between them, but now he understood. The distance wasn't his to close. It had been built brick by people who chose to see only what they wanted. And yet, even with that truth, there was grief. Not just for what he had lost, but for what never was. The childhood warmth he never had. The fatherly pride he never received. The soft encouragement he had always given himself, because no one else did. Still, he felt lighter. Standing up for himself didn't make him cruel. It made him whole. On his drive back to Chicago, snow falling softly against the windshield, Michael turned off the radio and sat in silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence he'd known before. It wasn't hollow or cold. It was peaceful. It was earned. Back in the city, he resumed work, returned to therapy, and started budgeting his inheritance carefully. Not as a weapon, not as a trophy, but as a foundation for something new, something better. He began researching nonprofits, mental health initiatives, and community programs. A seed had been planted. What if he could take what he'd been given and use it to help others who had grown up unseen, unheard, and unloved? What if this chapter didn't end with justice, but with purpose? That question would find its answer sooner than expected. And surprisingly, it would begin not with a legal document, but with a voice he hadn't heard in months. Because one day, Michael came home to find a voicemail from someone he never thought would reach out. It was Lindsay. The voicemail was only 17 seconds long, but Michael replayed it 5 times before he could breathe normally again. "Hey, it's Lindsay. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but if you're willing to talk, really talk, I'd like to come by. I think it's time." Her voice was quieter than he remembered, stripped of the airy confidence she used to float through life with. There was something else in it now. Weight, sincerity, maybe even remorse. They met on a Sunday afternoon, at a small cafe halfway between Evanston and the city. Michael arrived early and sat near the back, watching people filter in and out, unsure what version of his sister was about to walk through the door. When Lindsay finally appeared, she looked different, not just older, but grounded in a way he'd never seen. She wore no makeup, her hair pulled back simply. She wasn't performing. She slid into the seat across from him, clasped her hands together, and for a moment, just looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said. The words came out without preamble, without excuse. Michael blinked. "For what, exactly?" Lindsay took a breath. "For not standing up for you. For watching what they didn't, saying nothing. For benefiting from it. For all of it." She wasn't crying, but her voice cracked around the edges. "I didn't want to believe any of it for a long time. I told myself they just loved us differently, that you were stronger, more independent, that I needed more help. But the truth is, I let them turn me into something fragile, and I used that to hide." Michael didn't know what to say. Part of him had dreamed of this moment, Lindsay finally seeing, finally understanding, but another part of him had long stopped expecting it. "I was scared," she continued, "scared that if I stopped being their golden girl, I'd be nothing. I never learned how to do things on my own, because they never let me try. And when they asked me to take your share, I didn't ask questions. I just accepted it, because that's what I'd always done." She paused, then added, "But when you said no, something shifted. I didn't understand it at first. I was angry, but then I saw how calm you were, how certain. And I realized I'd never said no to them. Not once in my life." Michael listened, stunned into silence by the rawness in her words. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't a manipulation. It was the first real conversation they'd had as equals. Lindsay reached into her bag and pulled out a brochure, course listings from a nearby community college. "I'm enrolling," she said softly. "I'm going to figure out who I am, outside of their house, outside of their approval. I used part of my share for tuition. I hope that's okay." He nodded, unable to hide the surprise on his face. "Of course it is. I don't expect things to go back to how they were," she added. "I don't even know what that would look like. But I'd like to rebuild something, if you're willing." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe buzzed, with conversation around them, laughter, clinking cups, the low hum of a coffee grinder. But at their table, there was only stillness and healing. Michael finally said, "You know, I never hated you." Lindsay's eyes welled. "I always feared you did. I think I hated myself for not doing better." He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "Then maybe this is where we start." From that afternoon on, things didn't magically fix themselves. But they started to grow, slowly, authentically. Lindsay came by his apartment once a week. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they just watched bad movies and sat in the same silence they had once found unbearable, but now understood differently. One day, after class, she texted, "I applied for a transfer program, 4-year university, art therapy." Michael smiled, holding the phone with quiet pride. The golden child was beginning to forge her own light, one not built by others, but found within herself. And in doing so, she had given him something to, a sister, not an icon, not a rival, just a person, a woman growing up beside him. At last, it was this fragile, hard-won connection that would eventually crack something even deeper, something buried in their mother, waiting to surface. Because as Lindsay grew stronger, and Michael stood taller, Janice Dwyer, their mother, was beginning to feel the weight of her own reflection. and soon, she would come knocking to Dot. It began with a handwritten letter, tucked among bills and advertisements in Michael's mailbox. The envelope was unmarked, except for his name in soft, familiar cursive. No return address, just Michael Dwyer in careful blue ink. He opened it cautiously, half expecting another guilt trip or passive-aggressive defense of his father's actions. But what he found was something else entirely. "I've started therapy. No, I've hurt you in ways I don't yet fully understand. Would you meet me for lunch?" Mum, the words were uneven, like someone learning how to walk again after years of sitting still. Michael hesitated. He had built so much strength in the silence, protecting himself from her unpredictability. But something about the tone of the letter lingered. It wasn't grand. It wasn't manipulative. It felt vulnerable. They met at a diner just outside Maple Hollow Neutral Ground. Janice arrived first, sitting alone in a booth with a glass of water and a folded napkin clutched in her hands. When Michael walked in, her eyes lifted slowly, unsure whether to smile. He sat across from her, waiting. Janice didn't dive into explanations or excuses. Instead, she began with a question. "Did you always feel second to Lindsay?" Michael blinked, caught off guard by the directness. "Yes," he said quietly. "Always." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I thought I was helping her. I told myself she needed more. But I never stopped to ask what you needed." There was a long pause. "I thought you were strong," she continued, "that you didn't need as much attention. You were always so capable, so responsible. And I told myself that was love, too, trusting you to figure it out. But that's not what it was. I see now. It was neglect, dressed up as confidence." Michael didn't speak right away. It wasn't that he didn't have anything to say. It was that, for the first time, she was finally saying it first. "I started therapy because Lindsay told me you both needed space from me, and that broke me. Not out of anger, but because I realized I couldn't remember the last time either of you reached out just to talk." She unfolded something from her purse, a photo of Michael, at age 12, holding a science fair ribbon. "I found this cleaning out the attic. I don't even remember the project." "I do," Michael said. "It was about soil erosion. I stayed up for 3 nights, building the display." She looked down, ashamed. "I wish I'd seen you then," she whispered. "Truly seen you." A waitress refilled their coffee cups. For a while, they sat in silence. Not out of awkwardness, but reverence for everything that had never been said. Janice reached into her coat and pulled out a small notepad. "My therapist asked me to write down the names of people I wanted to apologize to. Yours was the first." She met his eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me today, or ever. But I want you to know that I'm trying. Not to fix everything, but to stop the pattern." Michael stared at her, this woman, who had once made him feel invisible, now sitting across from him, trying to put language to decades of silence. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel angry. He felt tired, but lighter. "I can't promise anything," he said. "But I appreciate you trying." That afternoon, something subtle but seismic shifted. Janice didn't try to rebuild everything at once. She didn't send long texts or show up uninvited. Instead, she gave Michael space, checked in without pressure, and most importantly began focusing on her own healing. She continued therapy. She apologized to Lindsay. She admitted the favoritism, out loud, during a small family gathering, her role without trying to justify it. And it was there, in that fragile honesty, that the cycle began to break. For Michael, it didn't undo the past. It didn't erase the pain, but it planted a new foundation, one built not on forced forgiveness, but on accountability. He and his mother started having lunch once a month. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they didn't, but each visit was a brick laid in the bridge between who they were and who they might become. Still, not everyone was ready, because as Michael slowly rebuilt pieces of his relationship with his mother, another silence remained stubborn and frozen. His father, and what came next, would be the final test of Michael's journey, not whether he could forgive, but whether he could let go of the need to be forgiven by someone who may never see his worth. If Margaret was the heart of the family, and Janice the awakening mind, then Richard Dwyer, Michael's father, had always been the iron wall. He was a man who believed that authority was virtue, that silence was strength, and that changing one's mind was weakness. In Richard's world, there were no apologies, only rules. And for most of Michael's life, he had obeyed those unspoken rules, desperate to earn the smallest nod of approval. But now, with the will upheld, and the truth exposed, the silence between them wasn't just tense, it was final. After the court ruling, Richard hadn't spoken a word to his son. No texts, no calls, not even a glance at family gatherings, which had become less frequent and more fractured. At Margaret's birthday celebration that spring, Michael arrived early with Lindsay to help set up the tables in the garden. When Richard walked in and saw them laughing together by the rose bushes, he turned around and left without a word. Michael didn't follow him. That was the shift. In the past, he would have chased after Amiga to fix, to explain, to justify his right to exist without being resented. But not anymore. Now, he simply watched the screen door swing shut and returned to arranging silverware. Still, the grief lingered. Not loud, not public, just the quiet ache of a son, realizing he might never hear the words he always hoped for. "I'm proud of you." One morning, Michael visited his childhood home to collect a few old belongings Margaret had retrieved from the attic. The house was the same white shutters, the tire swing still swaying lazily in the backyard. But the warmth was gone. Janice met him at the door. Richard was home, somewhere inside, but never came out to greet him. They spoke in low voices. She handed Michael a box filled with high school trophies, old drawings, a faded yearbook with folded corners. "He's still not ready," she said quietly. Michael nodded. "He may never be." She looked down, ashamed. "He thinks admitting he was wrong means he failed." "I know," Michael replied. "But pretending he wasn't wrong, that's what really failed us." Later, as he loaded the box into his trunk, he glanced back at the house at the dark window above the porch, where his father had once stood during every first day of school, coffee in hand, watching but never waving, and something in Michael released. He didn't feel rage. He didn't feel desperate for closure. He simply felt done. Letting go, he realized, wasn't about giving up. It was about choosing peace over pursuit. It was about no longer needing the people who wounded you to be the ones who heal you. He had spent so much of his life chasing the shadow of a father's approval, believing that if he achieved enough, spoke gently enough, stayed small enough, it would come. But now he saw the truth. His worth had never depended on Richard's recognition, and it never would. Back in Chicago, Michael began making changes. He donated the old trophies to a youth center. He framed one of his childhood drawings, the only one his grandfather had ever kept on his fridge, and placed it in his office. He started mentoring young adults at a local community center, many of whom came from fractured homes. They didn't need his resume. They needed his story. And for the first time, he felt that his wounds had become something more, less scars and more bridges. He no longer checked his phone for missed calls. He no longer hesitated at the thought of holidays. He and Lindsay had built a new rhythm: coffee on Tuesdays, long walks in the park, shared jokes that only siblings understand. And Margaret, bless her steady spirit, remained the anchor. Old stories, sharing recipes, reminding them both that healing takes time but always begins with truth. As for Richard, the silence continued. He missed Lindsay's college art showcase, declined an invitation to Thanksgiving, refused to be in the same room with his own children. But this time, Michael didn't internalize it. He knew that sometimes, people choose to stay stuck in stories they've told themselves for too long. That some fathers can't face their own reflection without flinching. And that's okay, because Michael had finally become the man he'd spent years trying to prove he could be, not by earning his father's love, but by learning to live fully without it. Ahead of him was a new chapter, one not defined by the pain of the past, but by the purpose he'd finally found. And it would begin with a decision that would change everything, not just for himself, but for others who, like him, had spent too long in the shadows. A decision that would turn legacy into light. It happened slowly, almost without Michael realizing it. Sunday dinners turned into cousin brunches. Phone calls with his Aunt Carol stretched past an hour, weaving through recipes, childhood stories, and laughter he hadn't shared in years. What had once been a fractured family now started to resemble something new, not perfect, not fully healed, but honest. After his father's silence became permanent, a quiet realignment occurred. The Dwyers began gathering differently. Instead of rigid traditions in the old family home, where unspoken tension hung like fog, they met at Margaret's cottage near Lake Geneva, potluck style, where no topic was off limits, and no one had to pretend. At one such gathering in early fall, Michael looked around the backyard. His uncles were flipping burgers at the grill. Lindsay was teaching the younger cousins how to screen print t-shirts, and Margaret was sipping sweet tea on the porch swing, her face calm, proud. For the first time in a long time, Michael didn't feel like he was on the outside looking in. He felt rooted, not because the family he was born into had finally come around, but because he had stopped trying to belong to a version of it that never existed. In its place, something better had emerged, organic, chosen, and whole. The biggest surprise of all, it wasn't just blood relatives filling that space. There was Jeremy, the retired teacher from his building, who had invited Michael to Thanksgiving when he had nowhere else to go 2 years earlier. There was Nina, his therapist turned mentor, who had taught him how to speak his truth without apology. There was Carlos, the college intern he'd once mentored, who now called him Big Brother, and showed up to help him paint the community center walls every other Saturday. Together, they became a patchwork of support woven, not by obligation, but by shared growth. Michael began to understand what his grandfather had meant when he once said, "Family isn't always who shares your name, it's who shares your weight." He carried that truth with him when he launched the Walter Dwyer Initiative, a nonprofit designed to provide therapy scholarships and financial literacy workshops for young adults from emotionally neglectful households. It was his way of turning pain into purpose, his way of honoring not just his grandfather's legacy, but reclaiming his own. The initiative quickly found traction. With the help of Margaret and a few community donors, Michael opened the first resource hub inside a renovated church in the city's south side. He called it the Haven. It was bright, filled with warmth, art, and the sound of people being heard for the first time in their lives. On the wall near the entrance, he hung a framed quote, "You deserve love without proving your worth." He saw himself in every teen who walked through those doors. He recognized the haunted look of someone who had been told their needs were too much, the slumped shoulders of someone trained to shrink themselves for peace, the cautious smile of someone not yet convinced they deserved to take up space. He didn't just counsel them, he sat with them. He listened. He validated what others had ignored, and slowly, they began to heal. So did he. Each Friday, he hosted what came to be known as Found Family Night. Anyone could attend. Students, volunteers, neighbors, even the mail carrier who'd once dropped off the letter that started it all. They shared meals, stories, songs. There were no roles to play, no approval to earn, just people choosing each other. One evening, as the group sat around a bonfire in the Haven courtyard, Lindsay leaned over and whispered, "This is what family was always supposed to feel like, isn't it?" Michael nodded. "Yeah, this is it." Not the brittle smiles of holiday dinners past. Not the tightrope walk of trying to please someone who refused to be pleased. This was freedom, connection, mutual care. He had stopped chasing his parents' love and found something stronger, belonging on his own terms. As the fire crackled and the night grew colder, someone began to pass around mugs of cider. Michael took a sip, watching the faces illuminated in light hold. Young, bruised, resilient. He realized then that family is not just the people who raise you. Sometimes, it's the ones who raise you up when you've fallen, who see your broken parts and don't flinch, who call you by your name and mean it. And in this sacred, unlikely gathering, Michael had built something better than what he was born into. He had built home, and that was only the beginning. Michael never set out to become a healer. He had grown up believing his role was to endure, to keep his head down, to work hard enough that love might eventually follow. But after years of silence, betrayal, and hard-won truth, he found himself standing in the center of something he hadn't expected. A mission. It began with a single conversation at the Haven. A young woman named Talia, no older than 20, had come in for a financial literacy workshop, but lingered long after it ended. She sat across from Michael in the small counseling room, arms crossed, eyes wary. "My dad says I'm ungrateful," she said, "that I always want too much. But all I asked was for him to show up to one graduation. Just one." Michael didn't offer advice right away. Instead, he nodded and said softly, "I used to think I had to earn love by shrinking myself. But the truth is, love that requires you to disappear isn't love." Talia didn't cry, but something in her posture relaxed, like a weight had been named. And for Michael, it was a mirror one that showed him just how far he'd come, and how many others were still walking that same quiet, lonely path. From that point forward, the Haven grew into more than a safe space. It became a movement. Michael expanded its programs: mental health support, legal advocacy for young adults navigating family estrangement, workshops on boundaries and emotional maturity. He partnered with social workers, therapists, even faith leaders who had once tried to bridge these emotional gaps in silence but now found themselves speaking louder. He launched a podcast called Rewritten, where guests shared stories of overcoming generational neglect, favoritism, and emotional manipulation. It resonated deeply, especially with older listeners, many of whom had spent a lifetime wondering if what they felt as children had been real. Michael didn't pretend to have all the answers. He still wrestled with grief, still sometimes stared at his father's number in his phone, wondering if closure would ever come. But what he had now was clarity. He knew his pain wasn't a weakness. It was fuel. Each workshop, each conversation, each moment where someone said, "I thought it was just me," was a reminder that the past didn't define him, it prepared him. One night, after leading a town hall on building healthy emotional boundaries, Michael stood alone in the community center kitchen, washing dishes. Lindsay came in, drying her hands with a towel, and leaned against the counter. "You're changing lives," she said. "Do you realize that?" Michael smiled but shook his head. "I'm just telling the truth. The kind I used to be afraid to say out loud." Lindsay looked at him for a moment, then said, "That takes more courage than most people ever find." It struck him then how different they both were from the people they'd been just a few years earlier. Two children shaped by imbalance, now carving out lives rooted in awareness, honesty, and choice. The initiative eventually earned national attention. Grants came in. University partnerships formed. A second haven opened in St. Louis, then another in Pittsburgh. Michael was invited to speak at conferences, asked to contribute to policy discussions about mental health and trauma-informed education. But no matter how far the mission stretched, he always returned to the root, that moment when he stopped apologizing for needing love, and started building a life that honored the boy who never got it. He framed a photo of himself at age 10, the one his grandfather had saved. It hung in his office, next to a sign that read, "Be who you needed when you were younger." That became his compass. And as the haven continued to grow, touching lives across towns and cities, Michael knew one thing for certain. His story wasn't just about pain. It was about transformation. It was about breaking the cycle, not with rage, but with purpose. And in doing so, he was no longer surviving his past. He was leading others into their future. Years later, on a bright spring morning, Michael stood in front of a crowd gathered beneath a white canvas tent, just outside a newly renovated building in Cincinnati. The banner above read, "The Haven, a place to begin again." He took a breath, glanced at Margaret, seated proudly in the front row, and began to speak. "I used to believe that surviving my childhood was the goal," he said, voice steady. "But what I've learned is that surviving is only the beginning. What comes next, what matters most is how we turn that survival into something greater, something that frees others." The crowd was silent, not because they didn't know what to say, but because many of them understood exactly what he meant. Michael had transformed the inheritance he once fought to protect into a living legacy. The Haven now operated in 5 cities, with dozens of staff and volunteers offering free therapy, emotional education programs, mentorship, and legal advocacy. Thousands of lives had already been touched. Some clients stayed for months. Others just came in once to breathe, to be seen, to know they mattered. But perhaps the most powerful transformation had occurred within Michael himself. He was no longer the boy who sat silently at dinner tables waiting for attention. He was no longer the man who needed his parents' praise to feel worthy. He had become a voice for the voiceless, a guide for the lost, a mirror for anyone who had ever been told they were too much or not enough. His story had inspired books, interviews, and even a university curriculum on emotional resilience. But he never let the spotlight consume him. His work was never about fame. It was about freedom. Back in Chicago, Lindsay had completed her degree in art therapy and joined the Haven as a trauma-informed workshop leader. The once sheltered girl who had lived in fear of disappointing her parents was now standing in classrooms, teaching teens how to express pain through color and movement. She and Michael hosted a sibling podcast once a month, simply called Reclaiming Us. Each episode began with the same line: "This isn't just our story, it's yours too." Their relationship, once strained and guarded, had become a bond defined not by shared trauma, but by shared healing. As for their mother, Janice continued therapy, still rebuilding, brick by slow brick. Some days were harder than others, but she never stopped trying. Her apologies were now actions. Support letters for grant proposals, baked goods for Haven volunteers, handwritten notes to estranged youth that read simply, "You matter more than they let you believe." Richard, Michael's father, never returned to the conversation, and that absence, once so unbearable, had become an accepted truth. Michael no longer waited for closure. He had written his own. One afternoon, while organizing boxes in the Haven's central office, Michael came across a small, yellowing envelope marked in his grandfather's handwriting. For Michael, when you need reminding, inside was a single photo. Michael at 16, standing beside a science fair project, beaming, and a note. You were always enough. Keep going. Love, Grandpa. He stood there for a long time, the hum of the office around him fading into quiet. This was his legacy. Not the money, not the buildings, but the belief passed down through one person who had seen him clearly, when no one else did. In a way, that belief had echoed into hundreds of lives, each one finding the courage to begin again. At the next found family night, Michael lit a candle during the closing circle, and invited others to share what healing meant to them. One young woman stood and said, "Healing means knowing I don't have to apologize for existing anymore." Michael smiled. That night, as the fire crackled in the courtyard, he leaned back and watched a group of teens laughing over card games, volunteers passing out hot cocoa, an elderly woman helping a nervous boy tie his shoes. This was what survival had led to, not bitterness, not distance, but empowerment. He had broken the cycle, and in doing so, had created a space where others could do the same. Not just for now, but for generations.